Aloha. I am Pōkā Laenui, and I am bringing this program to you from the valley that I'm from, which is Lualualei Valley, in the town of Waianae, from the islands of Hawaii. I'm on the island of Oahu, among the many islands that we have here, and so I'm recording this out of my very small office here in Lualualei. As I said, my name is Pōkā Laenui. I'm also known as Hayden Burgess, and I will try to answer some of the questions that many people have posed to me with regards to Hawaii, its history, its culture, and the present conditions of its indigenous people. So, with that, let me begin by talking about this place. I come from a nation of Hawaii. We had been recognized in the international community as an independent nation. In fact, if we go further back and we take a look at what is this place, Hawaii, and who are the people of Hawaii, we are an indigenous people with very, very limited contact with the outside world until Captain James Cook of the English Admiralty happened to come upon our islands as he was trying to do his investigation, his scientific investigation, to find a way across the Pacific to get back into the Atlantic and back into Europe. So in his travels, he bumped into Hawaii. He was lost. And it is said that he discovered Hawaii. Actually, we were not a people who needed discovery because we knew who we were, where we were, and although we did not have an excellent knowledge of other people in the world, we did have our own explorers who would canvass much of the world itself and brought back people of different skin color, of different language, and the rest. So we have a history, a very strong history of our own explorers going to different lands. But anyway, James Cook came to Hawaii, and we got into an awareness of the outer world. James Cook was able to bring news of his contact with Hawaii to the European world. He called us the Sandwich Islands after his benefactor, the Earl of Sandwich. There were some problems in cultural understanding, I will put it that way, when he tried to apply force against some of our Hawaiian rulers, and he subsequently met with an untimely or perhaps timely death. But he was killed here in Hawaii, and that was significant in that Hawaii became known on the map, one, as the death place of James Cook, who was a very well-known explorer and very highly regarded scientist. But it also brought news to the rest of the world of these islands of Hawaii. And as a result, there were many people who started making contact, coming to Hawaii, and used Hawaii for many different purposes. Over that period of time, very quickly, Hawaii became recognized in the international community as an independent nation. Our king, Kamehameha, united these islands, and in fact, just yesterday we celebrated his holiday here in Hawaii. He united the islands and brought about international recognition of these islands. He began trading with many other nations in the world. He sent ships to China, to Japan, and other places. Other ships came to Hawaii. So Hawaii became a very vibrant community, vibrant with activities from many different parts of the world. King Kamehameha was a very wise man, and he became familiar with international law, and part of it was because of the advice that he received, especially from Portuguese sailors who were very familiar with international law. And so quickly, Hawaii became recognized as a nation state. In fact, we were the first to salute the independence of Argentina when it gained its independence and traveled through the world. When it came to Hawaii, Kamehameha had known about its recent grant of independence from Spain, and so fired his cannons saluting the independence of this country. And in response, the ship that came from Argentina fired back at Kamehameha's Hawaii, recognizing in international affairs the integrity of both sides. So that was one of the first entry into international affairs. He also sent trading ships to other parts of the world, and as a result, they created an emblem, a flag of Hawaii, and that flag remains till today. Even when the state has adopted a flag, it has adopted the Hawaiian national flag. Hawaii was a very highly educated community. Missionaries came to Hawaii and brought reading, writing. Literacy was a new technology that the Hawaiian people immediately grasped to. Their language was the Hawaiian language. There was no, quote, written language, although we did have many different picture languages in our culture. But within about 10 years, we were the most literate nation in the world. After the missionaries brought into Hawaii the printing press and wrote out the Hawaiian language, the Hawaiian people just gravitated to it and were able to understand and deal with this literacy, this new technology, so quickly that we became the most literate people in the world. It is said that the people second to Hawaii in terms of its literacy population was the nation of Switzerland. The United States was far behind. By the year 1893, there was some agitation. The Americans who were in Hawaii, and many of them had become part of Hawaii. But those who remained in business and were in trading with the United States, heavily invested in sugar, wanted to take Hawaii and make Hawaii become part of the United States because they had to pay a tariff in order to trade into the United States. If Hawaii was considered part of the United States, then there would be no foreign tariff. And for every penny that was paid in the sugar tariff, that would be a penny earned for the profits of the sugar barons in Hawaii. So they developed over a period of time a conspiracy that these mostly American citizens, and they follow from a history, they were called the missionary boys because they could trace their family line to missionaries who came to Hawaii. At that time, the missionaries had a very excellent reputation in Hawaii. The missionary sons and daughters then started getting into politics and conspired with the United States to take Hawaii and give Hawaii to the United States. Now, on the other hand, what was the United States looking for? Why would they be susceptible to this conspiracy? The reason is that the United States had wanted to expand itself into the rest of the world, and they wanted to use Hawaii as a jumping off point to stretch into the economic arm or into the economy of Asia and the Pacific. They also wanted to use Hawaii as a jumping off base to follow a theory of what is called outbasing. The idea that if you are going to get into a war, you do not want to fight in your own home because it's your dishes, it's your television set, it's your windows that get broken. So the general theory is very simple. If we are going to get into a war, let's war in somebody else's home. Hopefully the enemy's home, but even if it's not the enemy's home, let's find another jumping off point. And so Hawaii was a convenient place because Hawaii had an excellent deep draft harbor in which ships could be based in Hawaii and then stretched out into the Pacific and into Asia as the Americans were trying to push itself further and further out into the Pacific and into Asia. So this conspiracy between your sugar growers and the U.S. military worked itself into an invasion and overthrow of the constitutional government of Hawaii led by Queen Liliuokalani. So there was a landing of foreign troops, a takeover. Liliuokalani, who had troops of her own to protect herself, but she was at that time so strongly a Christian, and I would suggest that she really is the forerunner, the mother of the peace movement. All of this occurred in 1893. And when the Americans landed the troops in Hawaii, she said, okay, I will yield my authority to the United States, who, through force of arms, have come into Hawaii and threatened my nation. And I will wait until the President of the United States is able to do an investigation and restore the life of the land back to our people. Now, the Queen was also a student of Hawaiian history because 50 years prior to that, an event similar to what had occurred in 1893 occurred in 1843, in which the British landed their troops, took over Hawaii, and then we had an admiral from the British Admiralty, Admiral Thomas, who sailed from South America, traveled to Hawaii, investigated what has happened, communicated with the Queen of England, and then said that it is not the character of England to simply take over a weaker nation and making it its territory. And so he returned or restored the life of the land back to the people of Hawaii. That was a day that we celebrated. We call it in Hawaiian Kala Ho'i Ho'i Ea, the restoration day, the day of the return of the life of the land. And so Liliuokalani was a very young girl at that time, but she grew up with this history and believing that the United States had the same character, was of the same culture, had the same principles of law and of fairness and of self-determination. She said, I will have the Americans do an investigation and restore the life of the land back to the Hawaiian people. Liliuokalani was also very adept at politics. She knew that President Cleveland had just been re-elected to serve as President of the United States. You see, Cleveland had served previously, and then when he ran for office, he lost the next election to William Harrison. But now Cleveland was re-elected in January of 1893. I'm sorry, the election had occurred before that. But he was to take office soon thereafter. In those days, it didn't occur in January. The inauguration of presidents of the United States occurred in March. But Liliuokalani had been good friends with President Cleveland and knew of the nobility of President Cleveland. So that's why she said, I yield to the United States until an investigation can be done and the life of the land could be restored. That is the essential history upon which today we continue to struggle for our independence, because the United States, although Cleveland reported that what happened in Hawaii, and you can find this in his writings, in his address to the U.S. Congress on December 18, 1893, And he reports to the Congress. He says, I cannot accept Hawaii as part of the United States because we committed an international crime. Without the drawing of a sword, without the firing of a shot, we have come in and we have taken over a nation, a trusting and confiding nation. And so he says, but because of the difficulty that he was facing within the U.S. Congress, at that time he had a split Congress. He had a very difficult time in his second term. He said, I shall turn this matter over to the U.S. Congress. And so he was not able to restore the life of the land back to Hawaii. That is how Hawaii became part of the United States without the consent of the Hawaiian people, without the consent of Hawaii. Now, it's difficult to go through all of the details of this story or many of the other explanations that I will have with regards to Hawaii. So I urge you to do your own reading. If you want a convenient place to find some of these materials, you can go to my website, and it's called HawaiianPerspectives.org. And look at the documents, and I have documents dealing with the history, dealing with the culture, dealing with our code of conduct, many other documents. Go to them, and just remember that it's being written, most of them by myself. I do take a particular view of these matters, but based on that disclosure, you can judge the historical accuracy, and you can check out my references and the rest. So essentially, that is how Hawaii became part of the United States, and still till today, many people, myself included, will argue that Hawaii is not part of the United States. We are captured, we are colonized, we have been aggressed upon, and by international law, the United States is obligated to decolonize Hawaii. I will get to another part of this issue of colonization very quickly because I realize that time is passing by. But a lot of people say, well, isn't it true that in 1959, the people of Hawaii voted to become a state of the United States? That is true, and yet it is not true. How? Because of the finagling of the United States and the United Nations. You see, Hawaii was eventually listed as one of the places to be decolonized. Under the Charter of the United Nations, Article 73, you find that there are certain places that were considered non-self-governing territories. Hawaii was one of them. Hawaii was listed as one of the places to be decolonized in 1945 when the UN was formed. Then the next year, 1946, the General Assembly decided to be very specific. They would name those places that needed to be decolonized, and they would name the colonizing power. At that time, they called them the administering authority. So what they really did was allow the administering authorities to come to the General Assembly of the United Nations and say, these are the places that we undertake as a sacred trust obligation to bring about self-determination, decolonization. And among those places for the United States was Guam, Alaska, the Panama Canal Zone, American-occupied Samoa, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. I think I've missed one other place. But we were specifically named along with these other areas. The Article 73 calls for an immediate cessation of colonization. Turn the place over, the territory over, to the people of that territory. Meaning that those people who have lacked the opportunity for self-determination because of colonization, these are the people who should be given the right to determine their future course as they unfold themselves into their future. Self-determination. What the United States did was they recognized that by 1959, about 1960, a new resolution would be passed. It was a resolution on decolonization. For those of you who follow those things, it's Resolution 1514 and 1541 of the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations had known that this was going to pass. So in 1959, and a year before that in 1958, anticipating these events to occur, they decided that they would take the initiative and have votes taken both in Alaska in 1958 and Hawaii in 1959, and have the people vote to become a state of the United States. The question placed on the ballot, both for Alaska and Hawaii, was very similar. Should Hawaii or Alaska be immediately admitted into the United States, into the Union of States? If we voted yes, we would become a state of the United States. But if we voted no, we would remain a territory of the United States. The standard of international law is that you give a people under decolonization consideration three choices. One choice, to be independent. The second choice, to be in free association with the colonial authority. The third choice is to be incorporated into that colonial authority as a state or as some other property of that territory. In this case, again, the question was, shall Hawaii be immediately admitted into the Union of States? We vote yes, we become a state. We vote no, we remain a territory. The question of independence was never given to the people of Hawaii. So a fraud was committed against the people of Hawaii, and then later on in the report to the United Nations, a fraud had been committed. But in the Hawaii case, as well as in Alaska, there was actually a double fraud. Because what had happened in Hawaii was that in order to vote in this election, you had to have been a resident of Hawaii for at least 1 year, and you must be a citizen of the United States of America. Our people, many of us, myself included, until this very day, take that position that we are not citizens of the United States. How could you take our citizenship away from the Hawaiian nation and simply convert us through an act of thievery back in 1893? Those of us who are not citizens could not vote. American citizens decided for the United States that they would give Hawaii to the United States. It was the wrong people who voted. So who were the Americans? These were people who just flooded Hawaii after the overthrow. And then they took up residence in Hawaii and began the control of Hawaii. That was never the intention of the General Assembly of the United Nations in the development of the Charter of the United Nations. It was a fraud committed against the General Assembly. It was a fraud committed against the people of Hawaii who are entitled to self-determination, who are entitled to choose independence. Not only that, but the United States allowed their military who had been in Hawaii for at least 1 year to vote in our vote on the question of statehood. So there had been so much setup occurring that what exists now in Hawaii is simply another form of colonization in which the international community had been led astray by this finagling by the United States of the rights of the people of Hawaii. And so we are attempting to make a correction at the United Nations. And again, you can go to my website at hawaiianperspectives.org and take a look at the United Nations document that we are submitting, asking the General Assembly to take a look at what had occurred in 1959 and correct those wrongs. All right, now I'm going to change the subject, and that is the question: what are the main challenges faced by the people of Hawaii? Challenges in the past. And I think I have covered that generally by going through that history and how we are continually trying to exercise our right to self-determination. One, we need the part of the challenge is to educate our own people, because we have been under an education system taken over by the United States. And when they came in and brought in the colonization, we were prohibited from speaking our language, from remembering our history. They retold a totally different history. Right now, Hawaii is going through a process of decolonization. But in that process, what we need to do is not only change the minds of the United States and those who control Hawaii, but here in Hawaii, we have to help people to understand what has happened to us. We need to go through the various stages of decolonization. Let me take a brief uh, excursion to this discussion and talk about this process of colonization and decolonization. I will be highlighting the process actually of decolonization. In colonization, you have a group of people who come upon another people's land and they begin to degrade, demote, criticize the very people, saying they have no custom, they have no government, they have no effective religion, they are non-Christians, or whatever the colonizer may believe in. And so you degrade the integrity of the indigenous people. And then you start taking over step by step. You ruin their traditional emblems of religion and the rest. I'm sorry I'm getting too far into that paper. But over a period of time, they continue in this denial that they did anything wrong and insist that they uplifted the people from the savage ways that they had to now the ways of essentially the colonizer, the civilized way. Okay. The process of decolonization is to overcome the denial of colonization. And that is partly done where people start to look back at their history, at their culture, and they go through a process of recovery and rediscovery. We understand where our roots are. We go back to our languages. We go back to our belief systems. We return back to our environment. We start studying as to who we were, had been, where we had come from. And in the Hawaii case, we recognize that we were an independent nation. And yet all of this was taken away. The national memory had been taken away from us. I didn't discover this until after I graduated from the University of Hawaii with a political science degree. I knew nothing about this. Then I joined the U.S. military. And while in the military, I discovered these things. I was surprised that we had been an independent nation. So these things had been taken away from us. The United States controlled our education system, our economic system, our social systems, our environmental systems, our political system, our judicial system, all of these things totally controlled by the United States. But over a period of time, people are able to get into a discovery and rediscovery of who they are, where they come from, getting into their culture, etc. Now, out of that comes a second phase of the process of decolonization. That second phase is the mourning phase, the anger phase, the awfulizing phase, the grumbling phase, the argument phase. And as we came out of, many of us have not yet fully come out of the process of colonizing, recovery and rediscovery. The second phase being the mourning phase. We become angry, At times we become very hateful. We become, in fact, even among ourselves, we respond in our own racism. We hate the Howleys or the Caucasians. We hate the Americans. We hate other people. And yet, at times, as we look back, we ourselves are part Caucasian. We ourselves are part Chinese, Japanese, and a multitude of various races. But this mourning phase is a stage that many of us go through. We remember too much of that history. What happens in the process of decolonization is, if we achieve our independence immediately, we may end up killing one another. We may end up killing other folks who live in Hawaii. We may end up becoming so angry at the fact that we had lost these things that we ourselves become our worst enemies. So I believe that there's a third phase that we need to go through. And that phase I call the dreaming phase. We need to think not about what we had lost, but what we can become based on the richness of our culture, based on the richness of our history. And we need to develop, to move ourselves forward and not try to go back and try to retread where we had come from. And we need to accept the modernity that comes with new things as time has moved on, and not lose sight of our anchors in our culture, in our history, in our language. So this process of dreaming is of utmost importance. We need to be respectful of all races, recognize that this, in fact, is where our people had been. The kinds of laws that we had, we refused to accept slavery. We talked about the equality of all nations, of all people. We started moving away from the hierarchy of the elitist attitudes of people who are kings and queens, and started moving towards a democracy, saying that the voice of the people is the voice of God. And so we need to move and bend towards that. Okay. So that's the third phase of decolonization, the dreaming phase. The fourth stage is, now I've forgotten the name of that stage, and that is a consensus stage, a period of time in which people, having dreamed, needs to reach consensus as to what is our nation to consist of. If we don't go to that, we don't go through the dreaming, we just try to become an independent nation out of the anger that we have not brought about consensus. We could develop into a racist organization. Many of our people at the very early stage of decolonization, going through the recovery and rediscovery stage and going through the anger stage, the mourning stage, were very angry. We hated many other people. We hated people with different religions, etc., etc. But that is part of the process. That's why the dreaming stage is so important. We need to elevate ourselves and think about the higher values, the longer destination of our people, and just not respond to the racism that have been bred against us, and now we're going to respond in kind. The fifth stage, after consensus stage, is the action stage. Many of us are very anxious to get into the action stage, to begin to apply our independence. But we haven't reached that stage yet. We have not reached a consensus. We're still into the dreaming, most of us. Some people are still stuck in the mourning, and other people have not yet gone through the recovery and rediscovery. So those are very general stages of decolonization. Again, go to my website and you can find my greater expression on the stages of colonization and decolonization. So getting back to The original questions that I had intended on answering in this interview is the United Nations, and how does the United Nations view the issue of indigenous people, and how do we in Hawaii face the United Nations? I would say that the United Nations is caught in split mindset. It's somewhat schizophrenic. On one hand, the United Nations has come out with all of these high principles, very important principles. They have come out with the issues or addressing the issue of human rights and fundamental freedoms. In 1948, they came out with a declaration of, what is it called now? I've forgotten it. The Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then in the 1960s, they spoke about the right to decolonization, a second generation of rights, the right of civil and political rights, the rights of social, economic, and cultural rights. So these were second generation rights starting from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And then they came out with a third generation of rights, the right against slavery, the right of children, the right of the environment. And they have been considering a fourth generation of rights, and that is the rights of indigenous peoples. Now, when they come across to these rights of indigenous peoples, the United Nations have been led by very high ideals, and also the complaints of indigenous people who have gone to the United Nations, myself included, screaming about the unfairness that the indigenous peoples were being treated by. On the other hand, the United Nations is a composite of independent nations. And not only they are a composite of independent nations, but they are, to a large extent, controlled, both in terms of budget as well as in terms of the General Assembly and the Security Council, by nation states. And nations essentially will represent their interests as a primary interest at the United Nations. As a secondary interest, they are interested in the issues of human rights, fundamental freedoms, fair trade, and all of these other issues. But the first leading interest is self-interest. So there you see the split, especially when you come to indigenous people. On one hand, they agree that indigenous people should have certain rights. But now the United Nations as a body has sort of moved away, not wanting to invade into the province of the states, the state members of the United Nations. And yet there is a continuing sense, just as we need to invade into the province of states whenever you have slavery occurring, whenever you have colonization occurring, whenever you have genocide occurring, there are certain issues that the shell of sovereignty of these states should not stop the United Nations from penetrating. And the indigenous issue is the same thing. So there's a back and forth strain in that question of the United Nations and its relationship to indigenous people's rights and to state sovereignty. Now, there's another issue from the indigenous people's side that we are saying, hold on. What is the treatment of indigenous people over this long history? It is a treatment which is a second cousin to slavery. And what I mean is this: how is it that indigenous people are recognized as the property of nation states on the basis that the nation states claims a certain territory And as a result of that claim of territory or property, anyone found in the territory is automatically the citizens or the residents or the people in which this nation state has authority over. That is why indigenous people are treated as second cousins to slavery, where you elevate property rights above the value of human rights. And so our argument, or at least from my point of view, and I cannot speak for all indigenous people, but from my point of view, is that that is a problem that the United Nations need to pierce, that states themselves need to ask themselves, if we are truly against slavery, then how can we allow the property claims, the territorial claims, elevate ourselves above indigenous people and fail to respect the rights of indigenous people, independently as human rights? So that's how I see the United Nations and how it is handling the treatment of indigenous people in many different views, in many different haphazard ways. People have asked me, how do the people of Hawaii maintain our cultural identity in these days? Well, you know, the people of Hawaii, and not only the native Hawaiians, but people who have adopted to being Hawaiian here in Hawaii, are in essentially a fortunate position to a certain extent. And yes, we have been victims of colonization and very badly treated by the U.S. as a colonizer. And I won't go through all the awfulizing things that have occurred to us. But there have been fortunate things that have occurred that we are products of. Because we had been an independent nation, we are able, and because our people recorded our history, because literacy came in at such an important time, we have been able to stretch into our ancient history, and our recorders were able to record these things so that we have a very rich history to get back into. And it is contained not only in our literacy, but also in our oralcy, in our language, in our chants, even in our dances, in our hula. They are part of that vast historical record, this wealth of culture that we have. So it's always present, and in Hawaii today, as we go through the decolonization process, these things are always rising up. So we are constantly able to tap into that history. Secondly, we are a people that follow generally an inclusion rather than an exclusion culture. We're always including people into our culture. And when we want to teach people, we are not hesitant to teach them of our dances. You take, for example, the hula. There are so many of our people and others who are practicing the hula dance. It's a very sacred dance for many of us. But to be able to share it and have others join in this practice, it gives greater strength to the cultural revival of Hawaii, so that it's not only the indigenous minority who are trying to revive Hawaii, but it is the people of Hawaii who have accepted the culture. And based on that, you have the uplifting of this general culture. The third point is that our environment. We have ocean completely around us. We have mountains and valleys all over the place. Unfortunately, we also have many military bases controlled by the United States. So there's that conflict. But the environment itself in the Hawaiian tradition, it represents so much of our gods. It represents so much of our culture. It represents so much of our language that it is constantly with us. Anyone who wants to stretch out and make contact with your culture are able easily to pierce the colonial veil and get back into our culture. All it takes is some stretching and trying to reach out and get in contact with our culture. So I'm not going to extend anymore because there's so many different areas that we could go through. But it's present, it's constant, it is part of Hawaii. Another question some people are asking is, how are you doing with this COVID-19 pandemic? And like all people, we are concerned. But Hawaii actually is not as bad off as many other places are. And one of the fortunate things that we have is there is a barrier. It's called the Pacific Ocean, the largest body in the world, and it separates us from others. And because the state of Hawaii has passed a rule that there is a 14-day quarantine for anyone arriving from other places into Hawaii. There are certain exceptions, and I don't like the exceptions, but generally that's a rule. So we are not visited as often as we had been with millions and millions of visitors to Hawaii. It also impacts our economic system, and so we're just going to have to learn to find different ways of survival. But COVID-19 affects us economically. It affects our the opportunity to work with tourists. But tourism does not make Hawaii. Hawaii cannot continue to be dependent on a singular economic system. First of all, we need to return back to our self-sufficiency. We need to return back to our agriculture. We need to return back to our ocean. And we need to understand what is enough. We need to understand what is necessity as opposed to what is our wants, our desires. And we need to provide for that necessity. So it's a good reminder that we are an island and we need to be dependent on ourselves first and foremost. So we need to be self-sufficient, and only to the extent that we can engage in other economic activities, we should engage in those activities. It's such a large discussion, I cannot fully express myself on that issue or any of these other issues in the limited time. And I see that my time is fast arising. So again, I want to remind you to go to my website at hawaiianperspectives.org, and I have many documents there. If you can get into my videos or my recordings, you may also want to visit there. And feel free to get in touch with me through the website or through my email at Laenui, Pōkā Laenui, Laenui at hawaiianperspectives.org. I want to thank the organizers of this video program for inviting me to be a participant with you. And with that, nothing more to say, I guess, but aloha, ahui ho.